Good morning, everyone. It is a great pleasure and privilege to be here this morning. I thank the organizers for the opportunity to share some of my thoughts with you today, but also to learn from this extraordinary gathering of people, including farmers from many countries in the world. So let me begin. In 2009, about 10 years ago, during the soybean harvest in Madhya Pradesh, I was sitting in the field with a young farmer called Vijay Tale. And that day, Vijay's primary concern was getting the harvest in. Because it had been raining a few days before, and he was focused on getting the harvester to do its work and bring in the harvest that morning. He had spent the week organizing to have the harvester, which had traveled all the way from rural Punjab to come to Madhya Pradesh and to actually get to his field in time, because the clouds were gathering, and as those who cultivate soybean know, that the pods start shattering, and there's a small window of time within which farmers must harvest and bring the harvest in safely. In the middle of all of this, I noticed his T-shirt, and I asked him, Vijay speaks Hindi, and I asked him if he knew what his T-shirt actually said. And he laughed, and he said it's his favorite T-shirt, so I shouldn't do anything to ruin it for him, but he said he didn't know what it said. And then I told him it said, "Make your own destiny. Apni naseeb khud banao," in Hindi. And Vijay let out a large laugh. And he said, "What a ridiculous T-shirt for a farmer to be wearing, which says, 'Make your own destiny.'" And he asked, what kind of farmer thinks they can make their own destiny? And almost as if on cue, the harvester started smoking and set up some smoke into the field, and Vijay ran in a second to address it to see what he could do. And he said afterwards, that is just one example of the kinds of everyday risks that farmers face. And he said it is an amusing thought that an Indian farmer would be sitting in his field wearing such a T-shirt. Vijay's humor is actually typical of many farmers across the world. I think for all of us who have worked with them, their extraordinary, sort of philosophical approach to these everyday risks, the ability to laugh even under extraordinary stress, and to share a joke in the middle of what is quite clearly a daily crisis for him in time to get this in, is quite typical. But it also shares reveals something of the bitterness and helplessness that many farmers across our region face when they think about what it means daily to bring in the harvest. That particular moment is a particularly vulnerable moment where the weather, whether market risks, whether his storage conditions, all of this was playing on his mind, not least the small matter of how he would have enough cash to pay the harvester driver who had come from a long distance and leaves shortly afterwards in time. And so he also needed to arrange enough cash to complete the transaction. In this small example, tells you a great deal about the kinds of risks that farmers face every day. Farming has always, historically, been a very risky business. But what farmers like Vijay Tale are facing today is both the intensification of old risks and the extensification and expansion of risks to encompass new aspects that are affecting farming. And just to very briefly set the scene, it begins, of course, with questions of land. Access to land, land insecurity, ownership, questions of, sort of thinking about fragmentation, the lack of recognition of title, but also then inputs, access to timely inputs and high quality inputs, seeds, water, fertilizer, labor, access to labor, which is complicated in all of these economies, credit, the right time at serviceable costs, weather and climate, which will be talked a lot about at this forum, and of course, as has already been mentioned, the extraordinary risks and volatility brought about by the market. One of the things that we have to take in mind when we think about agriculture today is that we have a situation where the scale, frequency, complexity, and context specificity of risks are all coming together. This means that we actually have risks at a larger scale than ever before, but they are also very context specific. The challenges that Vijay Tale was facing in his field were quite unique as well as quite general. Vijay Tale is actually a large farmer. He was a farmer of around 10 hectares, 25 acres. It's a very large farmer for India, where and in our region where over 90% of farmers are small and marginal farmers. His neighbor cultivated 2 acres of soybean and then took an additional 10 acres on lease. His risks were quite different than the ones that Vijay was facing, and yet they both shared common risks as well. So we have a situation where scale and context specificity come together. You also have a situation where the frequency of risks, I mentioned, I think 5 or 6 in the matter of a single day that he was trying to coordinate. The frequency of these risks has escalated and has become and accelerated and become more common, but equally so has their complexity. This makes it extraordinarily challenging for farmers who have to manage scale, frequency, complexity, and context. It also makes it exceedingly challenging for those of us considering solutions to these kinds of aggregate risks. Let's take a little bit of an example, a little closer when we think about land. We're actually looking at the insecurity of ownership and access across many parts of the Asia-Pacific region. Farmers still do not have clean title or access to their land. Those who have ownership rights often struggle to actually get the right plot of land. They struggle with mutation, questions of passing on that land to other members of their families. Tenants and sharecroppers, a very large proportion of our farmers are also landless farmers. Many are tenant farmers and sharecroppers, struggle to get basic recognition. This affects their ability to access inputs, to access guaranteed minimum support prices. It affects their access to credit, which is often in agricultural context tied to land and the ability to furnish clean title and property. Farmers are coping with land fragmentation. Land fragmentation is happening both as a result of family sizes and intergenerational transfers, but are also happening for a reason of other kinds of engagements with urbanization, with land acquisition. Across the region, farmers are dealing with the challenge of quality and declining productivity of their land. This is a problem both in terms of access to water, but very much so in terms of soil quality. Land is vulnerable to humans and to non-human actors. Vijay Tale and many other farmers across our region spend their nights close to the harvest, sleeping on their land to protect themselves from both human and non-human and weather-related challenges, right? This is just one example of land. I could go back and take exactly the same kind of complexity to inputs, to labor, to credit, to weather and climate, and to markets. What this tells us is that each aspect of agriculture is dealing with these multiple levels and layers at which we're seeing these challenges unfold. Here, one of the things I want to really highlight is the importance of understanding these risks and their interlinkages. This is actually one of the most important things, because if we look at land, we could find solutions to each one of these, right? We could look at them and say, how do we improve titling and ownership? How can we give recognition to tenants and sharecroppers? How do you combat the questions of fragmentation and think about land pooling? How does one address the enormous challenges of land quality and productivity? However, what makes agriculture so complicated is the ways in which these risks are interlinked and interconnected with a whole range of other risks. This begins with the fact that we are dealing with farmers who work both on and off the farm. A great amount of our attention is spent focused on the farm as a unit. But these risks happen on and off the farm. We also spend a large amount of time thinking of farmers as producers. But we pay very little attention to the fact that all farmers are also consumers. They are not only consumers of the very produce they grow, as in they both buy and sell agricultural produce and food, but they are also consumers of inputs. The journalist Harish Damodaran often points out that farmers, one of the challenges of the farming business is that farmers always buy in retail and sell in wholesale. The terms of their engagement in both input and output markets tends to be extremely poor. But many farmers, and we will talk more about this in the session on rural development as well, many farmers, especially small and marginal farmers, are also laborers. They are laborers for paid labor, in that they labor on other people's farms. They also do other kinds of labor off the farm, but they are also unpaid laborers, contributing household labor in a whole range of things as part of the production system. Many small farmers, and particularly mid-sized farmers in India, are also aggregators or petty commodity traders. So these are all multiple roles that the same farmer plays. Income is both augmented and depleted in multiple ways for a single farmer. This makes the analysis of farm income extremely complicated, because you're not dealing with a single kind of analysis. How much did you get from this particular crop? You're usually growing multiple crops on the same farm, and you're laboring and working on multiple different kinds of livelihood at the same time. Agriculture needs to be seen as an agroecological, agro-commercial, and socioeconomic system. If we don't understand the ways in which these linkages are combined, we are unable to address the challenges. This multiplication of risks is also the multiplication of opportunities. It is exactly the same reason from which you can take a vicious cycle where farmers are inundated with accelerating risks and extensifying risks and turn it into a virtuous cycle of thinking about agriculture. But this kind of coordination can only be done with public, government-led transformation. In many ways, we're at a moment where the benefits of the Green Revolution and its costs have both reached a critical point. In terms of the many achievements of food security that we have achieved over the last several decades, we are now finding a plateauing. The focus on cereals and the cereal centricity of that entire intervention is now being questioned. It has had, and we have seen this across the region, very large and serious agroecological consequences. While we have become actually better at coping with these, we are able to think about scale-neutral technologies, we're able to think about socioeconomic interventions, we are far more capable of leveraging a whole range of different kinds of technical and technological understandings. What we haven't taken away from the Green Revolution was the fact that it was a massive public intervention, that it was a massive coordinated public intervention. This time in 2019 is perhaps one of the most important windows that we have to go back to those lessons. We need new frameworks for public investment. We need to rebuild and strengthen agricultural systems and institutions, whether they're the institutions of agricultural science, whether they're the institutions of public extension and agricultural extension, our agro-commercial context, or new farmers and organizations. We have to rebuild and build state capacity for agriculture. And we vitally have to think about new frameworks by which technology can actually be adapted and adopted within this context of public investment. This calls for extraordinary coordination. And in my sense, this is where the ADB and organizations of this kind are so vital, because you can coordinate at different scales and across different kinds of entities in the region. Just to take the few examples that I mentioned: land rights and consolidation, agricultural extension and knowledge ecosystems, farmer-producer organizations where they have massive questions of capital, working capital constraints, and institutional capacities, market design and regulation. All of these require coordination, and all of these are areas where women and youth are critical. I will end with two brief points since we're at this forum. The first is that farm income support, which is one of the key things that governments are considering as a way to address the crisis in agriculture, is not a substitute for public investment and other forms of social protection. We must think of farm income support as a complement, an important complement, but for it not to be a band-aid, it must be a complement to public investment. And finally, just a plea for us to remind ourselves that historically, our regions have benefited from an understanding of agriculture as a multiplier, a driver for wider economic growth and development. This is what we need if we need to move from the current scenario of distress-driven diversification to a virtuous cycle of surplus-sustained diversification. To come back to Vijay Tale, I think in many ways, making an agrarian destiny must be a collective public effort. Thank you very much.